Hi, it's Mike again from Montgomery in Calgary with another story from Gnome Land. We're chatting with our neighbors the other day, and they'd looked around and were familiar with most of the gnomes and had asked why there weren't any golfing gnomes in attendance in Gnome Land in Montgomery. And it's a good question, and as is often the case with questions that get asked in and around or about Gnome Land, is that while there may not be an immediate answer available, something like an answer typically emerges in relatively short order, and that seems to have been the case here. Now, the nature of the question might get morphed a little bit, but instead of saying, do gnomes play golf, what the question seems to have morphed into is, what is gnome golf? What sort of rules does it follow? What sort of skills are required and all those sorts of things? And it turned out that several days later, this sign appeared in the backyard, in the middle of Gnome Land. And what it indicates is it's going to give us an opportunity to learn something about what gnome golf is and how it goes. And it's going to be demonstrated for us by apparently quite a well-known gnome golfer named Roger McGnomester, who has stepped away apparently from the Gnome Golf Tour to provide a bit of a demonstration here in Montgomery Gnome Land for how gnome golf is played. So let's have a look. We basically just followed Roger around. And while he wasn't actually out loud telling us what the rules and strategies of gnome golf involved, we were able to pick some of it up by watching Roger's demonstration. Now, in the middle of the backyard, we've got a roofed structure that sometimes is referred to as a gnome scholar's garden or a gnome zen garden. And what it appeared to be functioning as today is the gnome golf clubhouse, because that's the first place Roger went. And basically stood up on top of the little fireplace in the middle there and started by chatting with the gnome scholar himself at the far end. And then he slowly turned and addressed most of the other gnomes that were in attendance in the clubhouse that day. Once he'd done that, he magically produced a golf ball, lined it up, gave it a whack out of the clubhouse. Kind of just missed us as we were watching on from the outside. When we stepped back, we saw that he was teed up again up on the roof of the clubhouse. And it wasn't quite clear where he was aiming for, but he had his spotter with him, a little guy with a telescope, is going to keep an eye on the ball for him. And after a moment's contemplation, he wound up and whacked the ball, and off we went on the demonstration. His first shot landed in, I suppose you could call it a gnome golf hazard, although unlike sand and rough and things like that, this was kind of a grass forest that was the result of an earlier Gnome Land incident that was discussed at another point and another time. And Roger had to find his ball, and so he dug around a little bit, found it, lined it up, and took his second whack on this first golf demo hole. When we followed him and his spotter, we found that he was setting up his second shot and appeared to be aiming for the sunflower in the middle of this flower patch. Lined it up, got a nice little chip shot off, and it landed in the flower bed. And then he got in there and lined that up and had another little putt or chip shot or whatever you want to call it, and the ball successfully connected with the sunflower, which seemed to be what Roger was aiming for. He then set up again just below the garden area and fired off his next drive, which ended up, of all places, perfectly balanced on the back of the large moose that's been hanging out in Gnome Land for quite a while now. Roger didn't seem the least bit concerned. He climbed up, lined up his next shot, nice little chip shot over into the flower bed, situated just in behind the moose. Got in there, lined up his putt, clearly aiming for the sunflower plant at the end of the planter there, and tapped it in. And that apparently was the end of the demonstration for today. Now, I don't know what we've learned about gnome golf in its entirety, but I guess what we can say is that it's a game played very well by professional gnome golfers like Roger McGnomester. It's played in natural settings. It uses sunflowers as the pins and played in the natural terrain. So they don't actually carve out fairways or anything like that. They use existing conditions. My understanding is it also doesn't always take place in the same Gnome Land area. It can kind of warp from one part of the world to another from time to time, which is probably why we don't see an awful lot of it going on. They kind of come in, play a couple of holes locally, and then they're off somewhere else before we often even notice. Anyway, so there we are. We've had an introduction to and a demonstration of Gnome Golf by the quite accomplished Gnome Golf Pro, Roger McGnomester. So keep your eyes open, because they don't often give you a warning when they're playing through, and it all happens very quickly, very magically. So keep your eyes open. You never know what you're going to be able to see.